Another tradition I'd like to institute is to have faculty who know the lecturers do the introductions for each of the series. So I'd like Bob Somel to do the introductions for tonight's lecture.
Well, this is a surprise, isn't it? I'm glad everyone could make it. I seem to remember a bridge connecting this building to the rest of the campus. I think the only person here who likes to do this less than me is Ken. And since he just happens to be the director, I'm up here and he's down there. Despite that hang-up, though, I'm very excited and happy to be able to introduce tonight's lecture, the first lecture in the fall, by Charles Waldheim and Marilee Santos Mune. I sense, to the extent that I'm familiar with their work, a real continuity and extension of many of the themes and methods that have been emerging here over the last few years. And that's certainly cause for celebration and anticipation. The question that I think necessarily remains open by the challenge of this first lecture will be whether this event and not the work is simply a sign of continuity, or whether it will mark a development and expansion of UIC's recent trajectory. And that, I suppose, is something that we will all directly or indirectly be responsible for deciding as events unfold over the next 8 months. I first met Charles about 2 years ago on the eve of the Michigan-Ohio State football game, when I was moderating or immoderating a debate between Stanley Tigerman and Peter Eisenman, whom some of you may remember. Besides being the only person who asked a relevant question from the audience that day, the work that we had a chance to see in Charles's undergraduate studio was incredibly sophisticated and well-crafted, and we knew immediately that we're going to have to steal Charles from Michigan. Then, last year at this time, there was an untenured faculty show here, which, in addition to Doug Garofalo, featured the work of Catherine Ingram, Mark Linder, Greg Lynn, Eva Maddox, Maria Whiteman, Lily Zand, Mark Rakitansky. Some of them you may also remember. I turned my section over to 13 outsiders, one of whom was Charles, and referred to it at the time as the Future Faculty Show. So I'd like to thank Ken for persuading Charles to join the faculty and proving me right, and to tell him 1 down, 12 to go. Before joining the faculty this year, Charles Waldheim had been the Sanders Fellow at the University of Michigan since 1991. He's also taught at Penn, where he did his master's work, and at the University of Florida, Gainesville, where he received his undergraduate work. In addition, he was a former member of the collaborative studio with Moisin Mustafavi and Homa Fajardi, and he's also worked with Robert Mangurian from SciArc in a project mapping Hadrian's Villa, and is presently working on a summer construction institute for 1994. Marilee Santos Mune, who is still I guess I could say, as potential future, still currently at the University of Michigan as a visiting assistant professor and Muschenheim Fellow since 1992, and she's also taught undergraduate studios at Cornell, where she received both her undergraduate and master's degrees. Together, Santos and Waldheim have a collaborative practice and have worked for the last year on research projects and competitions, and are presently working on a small residential project for a site in the Dominican Republic. So without further polemics or camouflage, please welcome Charles Waldheim and Marilee Santos Mune.
Instructions for misuse, the language of communication, a provisional schema towards an architectural curriculum?
A survey of the recent products of architectural education might leave one unclear as to the relationship of these educational practices to one expected role of the architect, that is, the design of buildings. Certainly, we could suggest that one expected activity of those holding the authority to author buildings might be the legitimate exercise of authority in the drawing up of plans for future constructions. Given this all too reasonable shared assumption, why should the practices and the products of those training to be architects dissemble themselves so greatly from anything that we could reasonably expect to see as a building? Historically, into the last 2 centuries in the West, the training of a future architect was in the form of extended apprenticeships. The distance between those 2 terms, apprenticeship and study, could go a long way in tracing the 19th century transformation of the nascent profession. We would modestly and with a great deal of patience propose that architectural education might presently be enduring a 20th century reformation of some significance, and that this rupture between responsible professionalism and disciplinary identity might be sketched along the axis simulation-analog.
The parallel between the simulated process occurring in the academic environment with a legitimate process involved in exercising one's authority over the profession, i.e. the production of architecture, have begun to polarize. This polarization has recently provided us with the possibilities of analogous methods, equating the value and meaning of the academic process to the expected one of the architect. This increasing autonomy of the discourse of architectural education in the university has equipped us with the potential to speak of our own discipline. The effects, potential and ex post facto, of this slippage on the practices and discourses ventilating the architectural education are our primary interest as we offer this hypothetical outline towards a curriculum. The attempt of this research and case studies has been to produce a program outline for the beginning years of an education. However, it is not to be confused with an algorithm or a formula. This outline could be engaged at various levels and scales. It could be applied to a task within a project, to a complete project, to a semester's work, to a first-year studio, or to a 5 or 6 year curriculum. It will also sponsor multiple trajectories of reading, direct material and operational readings, as well as readings at the level of architectural knowledge. The program outline has the capacity to perform and move linearly in a spiral fashion, accruing knowledge and information in such a way that it will fabricate its own internal context and codes. It will allow for tangents, spirals, simultaneous actions, constant readings, accidents, intuition, interpretation, isolation of parts, and finally become the footnote to a larger text, an a priori to the outcome or product created when the piece has been engaged. Assuming the recent autonomy within the education, the fabrication of this outline reveals the difficulties confronted in overlaying a structure in order to map or frame the discipline. This difficulty manifests itself through the misuse of the schema in self-destruction. This deconstructive behavior is a representation of the oscillation, vibration, and spiral movements created by the intersection or condensation of the various movements, cultures, and discourses existing today. A commentary on the futility of this task. Analysis or synthesis? Footnote 1. Reaction. Engagement. Prejudice. And response. Footnote 2. Methodology and process. Reading, perception. Case 1. Examination of the component. Idea, concept. 2. Presentation versus confrontation. Case 2. Process involving an immediate retrospective analysis. Case 3. A general recycling of criticism. Information lost and gained.
Perception. A first reading asserts a position which seeks, in the tradition of humanism, to define an essence to architectural knowledge. Based in a universal psychology of perception or phenomenology of the human condition, this attitude seeks to isolate the truth of an architectural work based on its latent or imbued content, which is considered transhistorical, and work produced from this set of assumptions quite often seeks recourse, through means of representation, to the techniques and rhetoric of modern science. In these works, a concern can be found for abstraction, objective analysis, and the reduction of a particular project to its essential structure or diagram. These tendencies suggest a model of architectural interpretation where the meaning of a work is transparent to its author's intentions, and the subject of architectural production is, as is the subject of instrumental science, rendered ahistorically and external to the frame of analysis.
Process, perception. Case 1, examination of the component. Case 2, a process involving an immediate retrospective analysis. 1, description, translation. 2, experimentation and testing. Case 3, a general recycling of criticism. 1,
representation. A second position which emerges asserts that the production and interpretation of architectural works is always a problem of convention and never a question of essences, that in fact architectural knowledge cannot be grounded in a human perception or phenomenology which is atemporal, ahistorical, or universal. This position suggests that meaning in an architectural discourse is always produced relationally, as in other discursive systems, and is defined by its historical, read social, conditions of reception and interpretation. One particular evidence of such projects is their predisposition to engage in questions of the subject as fabricated by and through the architectural discipline.
crafting, fabrication. Case 1, examination of the component. Case 2, process involving an immediate retrospective analysis. Case 3, a general recycling of criticism, information lost and gained. 1, execution or process. 2, proposal or recommendation.
Fabrication. A third position might be outlined which rejects both previous models in their granting a central position to questions of reception and interpretation, either conventional or universal. This approach concerns itself instead with the material condition of a project's making and asserts the primary condition of the architectural project to be its madeness. This point of view affects a delay in interpretation, either multiple or essential, and in its place locates the processional, material, economic, and historical circumstances of a work's fabrication. An argument constructed along these lines of thought prejudices the multiplicity of architectural practices and is subsequently evidenced by a concern for temporality and embodiment in both subject and object.
Footnote 3, vehicle, means. A, consciousness or sight. 1, simulated condition or analog. 2, consideration of sight. B, implication, ritual, staging or temporal. Habitual or common. C, concentration or codes. 1, projected. 2, found. Resonances, texts, histories, fictions. Footnote 4, practices and procedures. Materials. Steel, plaster. Metal, lead. Glass, light. Paper, wood. Appliances. Camera, triangle, scale, ruler, eraser, knife, parallel, compass, sharpener, pencil, scissor, glue. Operations. Excavating, overlapping, assembling, centering, layering, covering, repeating, extruding, masking, joining, revealing, ordering, stacking, recording, locating, stitching, folding, cutting, fitting. As we mentioned earlier, this program serves as a footnote to a larger text. It is intentionally rhizomatic in demeanor. Therefore, each chapter participates as a microscopic segment. Each segment must inherently end and seamlessly attach itself to others. For this purpose, the boundaries are kept blurry and in some cases out of focus. Today, Charles will isolate and extend one potential lineage from this structure, one which grafts itself on at perception and traces a line from recognition to misrecognition, the deliberate misreadings that occur as a form of camouflage within an architectural production.
If we could have the second tray, please. I'd like to begin by thanking Bob Sommel and Ken Schroeder for their introductions. I'd also like to thank Ken and the rest of the faculty here for the appointment and the ability to stand here in front of you and speak. I understand this to be a time of healing within the architectural education community in Chicago. It seems that the wounds have yet to close, but both in terms of the physical structure of the campus and the fallout from its recent political past, it's a very exciting time to be here, and I'm very happy to join you. As Marily mentioned, these 4 footnotes form the footnotes to a larger text, of which I'll be tracing one line this evening. The outline or structure which serves as footnotes to this larger text replicates itself around these 3 privileged terms that we've been mentioning: perception, representation, and fabrication, and their 3 corresponding practices within the architectural design studio: reading, processing, and crafting. They form knowledge practices or machinic assemblages which act as the genetic glue for this agglomeration. Fabrication through construction to narrative or myth, the making up of stories; representation through presence to reproduction; perception through reading to recognition and misrecognition. It's that final line that I'll be pursuing this evening. There are a number of ways in which right reading or correct perception and its relationship to truth, a number of ways in which that body of knowledge has been privileged in the West. Certainly relative to architectural knowledge, the assumption that one has access to the true through one's perception of the world is something that has become habitual, common knowledge for us these days. There are a number of reasons why misrecognition or camouflage or counter-surveillance, as you would have it, might become important for us to look at it here at the end of the 20th century relative to architectural knowledge. Suffice it to say that this notion of surveillance or misrecognition begins to appear in late 19th century knowledge relative to the shadow side of surveillance in the work of the Panopticon and the prison, within the space of psychoanalysis, and after the turn of the century, through notions of the subconscious and the slip of the tongue in particular, and through that, through both Freud and Lacan, to some notion of semiology in this century, all of which, the trajectories of which might land us at a discussion of counter-surveillance or camouflage. Camouflage comes from the French camoufler, meaning to obscure or to hide, and that from chomouflet, which is essentially translated as hot face. It has to do with a joke, a blowing smoke in one's face to obscure one's vision and somehow get a good laugh out of it. So there we are. As a part of the festivities surrounding the Ohio State-Michigan game that Bob mentioned, a part of what Peter Eisenman's contract called for was the giving of a public lecture. And in this lecture, he prefaced the introduction of his most recent office buildings for Germany and Japan with this image, culled from the New York Times, this being the F-117A stealth fighter. Now, at this point, being a young assistant faculty member, I was wondering what particular relevance would this new piece of stealth hardware have for architectural knowledge, and in particular the production of architectural objects. The first recourse to that we might have would be to suggest that Eisenman is following Corbusier in the taking of industrial assemblages, either steamships, automobiles, and reinventing them as prototypes, as it were, taking their proportions and replacing the classical temples, the buildings of the Middle Ages, with some aspect of 20th century industrial production. He immediately assured us, of course, that that's not what he's doing at all. He assured us that this piece of stealth hardware, this billion-dollar piece of aircraft designed to elude radar, was giving us a glimpse of an assuredly post-Cartesian object, that is, an object that had been designed to dwell within a post-Cartesian world. In his argument, he makes an explicit link between the developments in our conception of vision and his most recent architectural projects. Eisenman prefaced his lecture by showing these two slides, and in particular relating the notion of the folded space within the surface of the airplane wing to the folded space within his most recent projects. At this point, I would argue that Eisenman is in fact operating as a camoufleur, but not in the way that he would have us believe. His insistence on positing the design process, in this case the folding of paper models, as the locus of interpretation for an architectural project, in this case his office building projects, is obscuring a potential usefulness of this process once liberated from the requirement of transporting the project's meaning. And I'll hope to elaborate on that a little bit more fully as we go on this evening. Obviously, this reference to camouflage is not an isolated incident. There are any number of examples within recent architectural discourse of references by both architects and theoreticians to techniques of counter-surveillance, and in particular camouflage. For example, these are a couple of images from a project by Thomas Leeser called The Falling House. This has been published in Assemblage, I believe, and it includes an explicit reference to the dazzle painting of World War II battleships. In addition, it's possible to see some of the work of Jeff Kipnis, in this case, Form After Formalism, Regulating Lines, this being a portion of the Chance Affiliations show that Bob hung last year, relating to this intention to deliberately disrupt the surface of the architectural figure and thereby relate it to some notion of camouflage. To begin an understanding, then, let's look at the history in a way. Camouflage is quite often referred to as one department or one segment of counter-surveillance, counter-surveillance being the general body of techniques and body of knowledge used to resist the surveillance of one's body or the body of the other. It's a relatively new area of work. This image on the left from World War I shows Royal Navy Lieutenant Norman Wilkinson and a band of renegade artists painting Cubist designs on the side of model battleships for the British Navy. By the middle of World War I, all of the principal naval combatants were dazzle painting their battleships to great success relative to those that weren't painted, and keeping these ships from being sunk by enemy torpedoes. Now, there were a number of lines of thought which culminated in the application of this particular knowledge to these ships in World War I, none the least of which is the Cubist painting itself. In addition to knowledge of Cubism, and the appropriation of this information by the French initially. There was the work of the American naturalist Abbott Thayer and his work in animal mimicry and countershading. And there's also the development of Gestalt psychology and principles of figure ground and pattern recognition. The culmination of those three areas of work led to the possibility of this application. And quite often in recent discourse, it's these images that we'll see, either the drawings or the actual ships themselves, being referred to as somehow analogous to the busted-up surfaces of deconstruction. If it were possible to offer a shorthand version of how camouflage operates, it might go something like this. By one of two mechanisms, or through a combination of the two, an object, whatever that might be, is rendered indistinguishable from its background by becoming so like its background that it doesn't signify visually. A second technique would be to take that figure, that object, or that body, and disrupt its outline to the degree that it no longer forms, again, at the level of signification. In his text, Art and Camouflage, Roy Behrens gives the following account. Camouflage is disorder, as are trance and ecstasy. Camouflage makes it hard to see what is supposed to be alike and what is thought to be distinct. By these two maneuvers, by which all things look alike, or by which a thing is split, camouflage makes it hard to see a part within thinking. In order to perceive, a figure must emerge from a ground, then one must also sort to see. In these two slides, there's the image of an animal, which is possibly imageable by certain of you, but is largely indistinguishable from either its background or its surface. In this case, animal mimicry, or camouflage in the natural world, is relying on both of those types of camouflage, both low visibility, rendering the object indistinguishable from its background, and also what's referred to as dazzle, the breaking up of the figure into several shapes which would not be read as a single object. To extend the argument relative to architectural concerns, it might be possible to give the following definitions. Counter-surveillance generally might be referred to as containing three departments, of which camouflage is one. It also includes concealment and deception. Concealment might be thought of as the false absence masking a true presence. Deception, on the other hand, the inverse, might be thought of as a false presence masking a true absence. While camouflage, I'll be referring to as the subtle manipulation of the codes through which a visual presence or absence is signified. At this point, as we discuss visual signification, it might be interesting to mobilize the work of Norman Bryson in looking at visual representation as an essentially semiological practice, and through Bryson, accessing the work of Jacques Lacan and notions of the gaze, and in particular, his writings on animal mimicry and the degree to which animal mimicry is an analogous operation within the animal world, as is painting is within the human world. Refuting Thayer's position, essentially, that animal mimicry or camouflage on the surface of animals' bodies has to do with protection from harm or staying away from predators. In this particular example, we see both cases of low visibility and dazzle camouflage in operation. And we also see the problematization of this question of whether the camouflage is present to provide protection for the animal, following an argument of natural selection, or following Lacan, is it present in as much as signifying practice for the animal in the way that language, or following Bryson, painting is for us. Now, in hoping to gain some access on the intersection of counter-surveillance or camouflage and architectural knowledge relative to these recent projects, the initial image that we have is this one here, where both concealment and deception are employed in this subtle art of camouflage to hide one, usually in the application of some sort of military knowledge. But there exists a wide body of knowledge, an historical precedent for directly or indirectly, less directly, architectural applications of the work of camouflage. These two images show the Lockheed bomber plant in 41, late 41 or early 42, when its roof was painted to resemble the suburbs surrounding Los Angeles, which it was adjacent to. This was largely the work of Disney's Imagineers, or people that would finally go to work in the animation business after the war. And this is a detail of that, the painting and fabric construction on the roof to stay away from the impending Japanese invasion. This is a view of their parking lot underneath. Now, beyond this notion of concealment present in that first architectural example, there are any number of examples of deception. In this case, decoy bombers in the Mojave Desert, and on the right, the landscape of those bombers displayed to detract bombers from their intended target. On the continent, both French, German, and British Army units used both dummy airplanes and dummy tanks to great effectiveness. And in one particularly grand example, the inner harbor, the aiming point at the end of Hamburg's inner harbor, was moved in 1944 by almost 6 or 7 blocks, nearly a square kilometer of area covered by a wooden roofing structure to obscure the visual appropriation of the city from the air. It's possible to see the extension of this knowledge into the painting of shadows on the ground to disrupt the appropriation of targets. And on the right, you can see an example of a movable shadow. And following Bryson through Lacan, if it's possible to see the shadow as that aspect of the object, in this case, a technical object, in our case, an architectural object, if it's possible to see the shadow as the site for visual signification, then we've come a long way towards sorting out where precisely we might look for the intersection of architectural knowledge and camouflage. This is by way of a more recent example. Both our government and the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, continue to build and deploy dummy aircraft. This one on the right, the sheet metal one, costs about $20,000 as opposed to the real aircraft, which is about $1 billion. And in some way, it's possible to see this as a metaphor for the Cold War in total. There are a number of other directly architectural applications of this knowledge, most of which have military precedent. To a certain degree, they involve the obscuring of significant military targets within the landscape, or the reverse, the decoying of insignificant figures as to detract resources. These are two particularly interesting sources. On the left is a road which is obscured by a vertical wall, which had the same effect of obscuring the road as would have covering the road over with foliage. And on the right is a stream in England which has been completely dusted with coal dust so as to make it indistinguishable from the adjacent farmland. And by way of bringing us back to thoughts more recent, this is on the left is a Luftwaffe bomber headquarters from World War II, and on the right is the project by Mary Miss, Perimeters, Pavilions, and Decoys. Now, to date, the vulgar criticism of the application of camouflage to thoughts architectural has followed along these lines. The appropriation of the image of the F-117 stealth fighter or the dazzle-painted battleship has to do with a visual analogy between the technical object, the airplane or the battleship, and the surface, the formal surface of the architectural object itself. Following that, it's possible to see Eisenman's production, some of the other projects that we've seen, as participating in a form of dazzle camouflage, where the architectural object, the figure of the architecture, is meant to dissemble itself so greatly about its surface that it no longer signifies visually. Now, the inverse of that, the flip side of that, as a criticism of the neoconservative version of postmodernism, appropriates a low visibility strategy of camouflage, whereby the architectural figure is meant to be indistinguishable from its surroundings through the recession of its object into a variety of sites. this being the dazzle example, the literal deconstruction of the architectural figure through visual analogy, shape likeness, so as to render difficult or at least change the status of the reading of the object. And in the case of neoconservative postmodernism, through a recession to a variety of sites, typology receding into memory, contextualism or contexturalism, depending upon where you're from, receding into context, and classicism or neoclassicism receding into history or historicism. For our purposes, it seems to be the most likely place to find an intersection between counter-surveillance and architectural knowledge at the birth of technology of surveillance to begin with. In large part, 20th century technologies of counter-surveillance are seen as a shadow or a response to the techniques of surveillance which were developed in the early 18th, mid-18th, and early 19th century. The most paradigmatic place to begin, then, would be with Jeremy Bentham's Panopticon and the exposition of this project in Foucault's Discipline and Punish. In this particular case, the architectural object, as a product of the late Enlightenment, is seen as not simply a vessel to contain the prisoner, upon which the edifice would be representational of some larger political or religious order, but in fact, the compartition of this architectural figure is intended to intervene in the functioning of the bodies within. And as Foucault elaborates, the operation of the Panopticon places a single guard at the center of the visual field, surrounded by an annular ring of glazed cells, this being a complete inversion of the prison type to date. The light casting through these glazed cells to the inner ring would allow the perfect visual apprehension of the body of the prisoner by the eye of the guard. And it's an almost perfect example of the technique of visual surveillance intervening not only in the construction of our bodies as socially constructed beings, but in literally architectural terms, the figuration of this and several other projects. This topic is dealt with much more fully in a text by Robin Evans. His thesis, entitled The Fabrication of Virtue, which traces the history of English prison architecture. This image, following the Isle of Pines prison in Cuba, this image is a series of photographs by a man called Jan Dibbets. Working in the late 60s and early 70s, Dibbets began to produce a practice of photography dealing primarily with architectural themes, but sometimes with landscape themes. And he began with this series called the Longest Day series. This and a parallel obsession with techniques of perspective and the rendering of perspective in a particular way relative to anamorphic projection. The image on the left is from a studio, the image on the right is a landscape installation. I think it's possible to locate in the photography of Jan Dibbets the beginnings of a line of inquiry that would place us relative to counter-surveillance and camouflage coming out of anamorphic projection itself. Particularly the dazzle version of camouflage and the disruption of the figure through the means of visual representation to the degree to which it no longer figures, it's no longer significant or visible. These are some landscape appropriations and transformations, taking what's largely a flat horizon and transforming it into some mountainous landscape, or the inverse, taking a mountainous landscape and camouflaging that within a horizontal landscape. In the 70s, he goes on to deal with more specifically architectural themes in his work, in this case, the architectural projection through anamorphic projection of these roof structures in Paris. And his trajectory continues down the continent. He visits Italy and photographs a number of Roman sites, continuing the anamorphic projection toward a dismantling of the image it's fairly possible, I think, to locate in the birth of anamorphic projection the nascent beginning of dazzle camouflage. In this case, the sketch on the left by Leonardo, an early version of anamorphic projection. And this is in some ways an illustration of the flip side of Leonardo's suggestion that we go as artists and stare at walls, and that in the stain on the wall or in the cloud on the sky, there might appear to us a figure, and that that figure might bear some resemblance to something which has a legitimate visual significance to us. In this particular case, something of an admitted visual significance, the head of a small child, is transformed to the point that it no longer signifies and starts to read like a cloud or a stain on the wall. Moving from that version of dazzle camouflage within visual representation, we might locate an actual literal version of camouflage relative to the architectural figure in the work of Gordon Matta Clark. In particular, the slide on the left, Doors, Floors, and Doors from PS1, where the extraction and removal, literal dismantling of portions of the building, begins a process of dazzle camouflage through which the architectural figure would cease to be visually significant. If that's the dazzle end of the spectrum, it might be possible to find analogous work on the low visibility end of the spectrum. These are two canvases by Lucio Pozzi, again from the PS1 installation. Both of these paintings began their life as the recording of an exact condition found in situ on the walls of this public school. The representation of that condition and then its superimposition over the original site renders it virtually invisible. And in this way, this visual representation is engaging in a version of low visibility camouflage. Following Rosalind Krauss's work, if we speak of this as an indexical sign, a sign which points to itself, we'd be in a reasonably good position to tie Bryson and Lacan back into the visual signification which points to itself. A visual signification which points to itself to such a degree that it becomes invisible. As the mirror image to the work of Jan Dibbets and dazzle camouflage, I would propose, in terms of low visibility, the work of Becker and Becker. In this particular case, a couple producing a lineage of photographs, a physical practice that deals with the recording of various typologies, particularly dealing with industrial structures from the late 19th and early 20th century in Germany. In this particular case, the degree to which the architectural figure, this structure, loses its visual significance relative to its immediate surroundings, the presence of so many other seemingly like examples of the same, might allow us to then return back to the question of architectural knowledge and these two forms of counter-surveillance. It might also bring us a little bit closer to home. This is IIT, obviously. And what I'd like to just conclude with is a proposition that, in this particular case, the losing of a distinction between an object, a figure, and its neighbors, or the dismantling of that object to the degree to which that object no longer signifies or figures visually, are both operations which have occurred within the history of architecture and in the finest examples will continue to be present. Returning briefly to this notion of the chaud mouflé, or the hot face, blowing of smoke, I think it might be possible to begin a history of counter-surveillance within architectural production. And that as an archaeology of modernism, this body of knowledge, this historical research, would almost assuredly locate both forms of a false absence, which masks a true presence, side by side with a true absence, which masks a false presence. And that ultimately, that concern for the subtle manipulation of the codes through which something signifies visually can be found already occurring around us. I'll just end with a fragment from Baudrillard. To dissimulate is to feign not to have what one has. To simulate is to feign to have what one hasn't. One implies presence, the other an absence. But the matter is more complicated. Since to simulate is not to feign, someone who feigns an illness can simply go to bed and make believe that he is ill, while someone who simulates an illness produces in himself some of the symptoms. Thank you very much.